Hi, everyone. For those of you who are on live, that song was almost over, and I feel like sometimes I'm not able to get it right perfectly with the timing, and then it ends on that like really like just very crazy moment. So anyway, just that's Larry Weiner's composition. Um, Anyway, my name is Sarah Weiner Cooper. I'm Executive Director at New Directions American Landscape. We're an educational organization dedicated to the art, culture, and science of ecology-based landscape design. The session is part of NDAL's March and April virtual educational series, and it is entitled Gardens as Pollinator Habitat, Limitations, Potential, and Context with presenter Douglas Sponsler. Thanks all of you for joining today and all who will watch the recording later. We'd love if you would like to write in the chat box what your area of interest or expertise is and where you are tuning in from. And we want to thank our co-sponsors for this series, Wild Ones, American Horticultural Society, and Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. This session will be an hour and 15 minutes long in total. Feel free to write your questions in the Q&A bar at any time, and we'll get to the questions at the end. And it'll be recorded and viewable by all registrants for 3 months through the NDAL events portal. Please mark your calendar as access to the recording will end in 3 months on June 14th. So we're unable to extend that date, so please mark that calendar. I'll follow up with an email with all instructions after this session to let you know how to get to that recording. So I'm excited to hear Doug's talk today. His emphasis on gardens as not only spaces, but places and time is so important. So without further ado, I will introduce Douglas Sponsler. Doug was born and raised in Philadelphia, where his love for nature grew out of time spent in urban parks and gardens. He completed his PhD in entomology at Ohio State University, did a postdoc at Penn State University, and is currently a postdoc at the University of Würzburg in Germany. From the fields of Ohio to the rooftops of Philly to the Alps of Germany, the theme of his work has been the relationship between flowers, insects, and people. Take it away, Doug. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our session tonight. I say tonight because it is kind of night for me. It's 7 p.m. here. And I have to admit, 7 p.m. is past my prime for the day. So if I seem a little slow-witted, that's my excuse. But I've been looking forward to this talk very much, though. I was reminded of a story. Since I have like an hour to talk to you, I get to tell stories. But when Sarah commented about stopping the music a little prematurely at the beginning, I heard this story once of this guy who his dad was a musician, and this guy was a young guy, and he would come home late sometimes after his dad was already in bed, and he would go to the piano and play the first 7 notes of a C major scale, and then stop and go to bed. And his dad would hear it and would have to get out of bed and come downstairs and play the last note to resolve the scale, or else he couldn't sleep. So I don't know what that has to do with this talk, except that you may end up with a feeling of lack of resolution at the end. But I actually think that would be appropriate, because the goal of this talk is to motivate you to go out and do something. The resolution is your responsibility. The title of the talk is Gardens as Pollinator Habitat. The talk is gonna, it's one of those cases where I wrote the title before I wrote the talk, and I think the talk became rather broader than the title, but it will certainly include discussion of gardens as pollinator habitat, but it may go a bit afield of that too. So I hope you enjoy it. By way of introduction, I wanted to tell you a little bit of my background. Sarah mentioned it a little already, but I wanted to do it with pictures. So I grew up in Philadelphia. I'm very proud of this picture because these are my, if you're familiar with iNaturalist, it's a fun platform for logging and sharing nature observations. It gets geo-stamped and time-stamped, and people can cooperate to identify things. Anyway, these are my iNaturalist observations from Philadelphia. You can see what my bike commute looked like. I worked in Center City, and I lived up in the Northwest, but I was born and raised in Philly. It's still a place that's very close to my heart. It's a place that I hope to make it back to someday. But I went from Philly to Ohio. And in Ohio, one of the things I studied was the floral resources of Ohio's agricultural lands. We tend to think of ag lands as being these deserts, right, of resources. It's not quite true. It's because agricultural areas have weeds. The weeds are what saves them. And in this particular image, you can see that this Ohio field is just painted
Oh,
purple.
sorry, Doug. We aren't seeing your slide. You'll have to share your screen.
Oh
I'm
no,
sorry, I'm just realizing
thank you,
this.
thank you for interrupting me. It's very important that you see the slides. Okay, so this is that first slide,
Got it.
the one I was bragging about. These are my iNaturalist observations. Um, Pretty cool, huh? This is the field I was talking about, the field in Ohio that's just painted purple with purple dead nettle, Lamium purpurea, with this beautiful stripe of yellow dandelion on the edge. This is a very rich time of year for floral resources in Ohio in the spring. And then from Ohio, I did a postdoc at Penn State, but at Penn State, I really leaned on my supervisors until they let me go back to Philly to do my research there. And I'm going to talk more about this research later, but it involved working with bees and being on rooftops, and it was the most fun I've ever had in research. But postdocs are short things, and this one ended, and the next opportunity took me to Germany, which I did not expect. It's a long story, but here we are now, and we live in Lower Franconia near the city of Würzburg, and it's a wine growing area. So the landscape is this beautiful hilly landscape of vineyards around the river valley of the River Main. So before I outline the talk, I wanna give you a sense of the goals that I have, and I hope that they are goals that motivate you. First, I want to move from association to understanding. This is a theme that my thinking on this has developed as someone who has worked with pollinators from the beginning. I noticed that when people think and talk, write about pollinators, it is a very high energy field. People have strong feelings about it. People are very motivated about it. But the hazard of such topics is that the energy behind it can result in sort of enthusiasm that glosses over vagueness. And what you often get is this is a word cloud that I made. I just took the text out of something from Greenpeace about pollinators and turned it into a word cloud. And I think this sort of represents the way that pollinators are often talked about. We have these associated concepts, but we don't often get to the point of actually articulating a coherent understanding around pollinators and their ecology, and I want to achieve some of that today. The second goal is to go from a still life perspective on ecology to a process-based understanding of ecology. And the difference between still life and process, of course, is time. I want to practice taking time seriously, taking it explicitly. Understanding ecology is something that happens in time, something that unfolds as a process. So we're going to practice that today in the context of plants and pollinators. And then finally, I want to go from the screen to the garden. It should not be hard to persuade you to do this since you love your gardens, I'm sure. But here we are looking at screens. And I want to end this talk with something that motivates you to go out and do in the gardens that you love. Just as something of a disclaimer, my goal is not so much to be practical in the usual sense as it is to be relevant. I'm going to leave the practicality to you because frankly, you are the leading experts on your gardens, right? The practicality is your responsibility. I'm not going to tell you what to plant. I'm not going to tell you how to arrange your plants or how to deal with pests or fertilizer or things like that. I entrust you with the responsibility to figure out. You're a better expert on it than I am. But I do want to motivate you with thoughts that are relevant to your gardens and leave you with the creative task of figuring out what application means. Okay, so those are the objectives. Now I want to outline a little more explicitly what the content of the talk is going to be. So for starters, as an effort to to dispel vagueness, to move from association to understanding. I want to lay the groundwork for my understanding of plants and pollinators and their ecology. And it's maybe a slightly heterodox understanding, but it's one that I've uh, I've written on and I believe in, and I'm gonna tell the story the way that I've come to think about it. I hope that you find it stimulating and for your own imaginations about plants and pollinators. Then I want to talk about the temporal ecology of pollinators and indeed of gardens. And the maxim here is that habitat is made of time. Habitat is made of time just as much as it is made of space, and we should work on understanding it that way. And I think we are already primed to do that as gardeners, because gardening is very much a process. The work of gardening is extended in time, and we know that and feel it. And I think that gives us an intuition for the intrinsically temporal nature of ecology. I want to look at it at three scales, though: months, minutes, and millennia. This was a wonderful opportunity for alliteration. I try to never miss them. And in case that was not enough alliteration for you, we're going to segue out of that into our final topic, which is moments. And I'm going to leave this a little open-ended. We'll see how this part goes, but it is the most speculative part of the talk, but it's also the part of the talk that ends in asking you to do something. So I'll leave you hanging that for now. All right, flowers and pollinators. Let's let's just clarify what it is we're talking about here. And again, we want to go from a word cloud of vague associations to a clearly articulated understanding. Not a comprehensive understanding, not an understanding that banishes the mystery of it all, but one that enables us to speak clearly. So it starts with an evolutionary story that goes something like this. Somewhere in roundabouts the mid-Cretaceous, which is about 130 million years ago, flowers that looked kind of like this. This is actually a type of gymnosperm flower. Gave way to flowers that looked kind of like this, which you probably recognize as looking quite like a modern magnolia, which indeed is what the first angiosperms or flowering plants looked like, as far as we can reconstruct from fossils. Note that it is not that flowering plants invented flowers. It's a misnomer. The fact that angiosperms are called flowering plants, it's really a bit misleading. This is a flower too, for all practical purposes. It's a flower. But what angiosperms did, Dawn Frame tells this story really compellingly, is they discovered the benefits of being eaten, to put it succinctly. She says, what really differentiates most angiosperms is their edibility. And this extends to their flower. What angiosperms did, in a sense, is harness the basically negative phenomenon of herbivory, getting eaten, right? And turn it into something good, which is quite a move when you think about it. There are not very many organisms for which you can say getting eaten has a bright side. For flowering plants, it does. The key is just to really focus that herbivory on the floral structures. And they do that by supplying nectar as a reward and making their pollen edible, even though it is also the male gametophyte of the species. It is the means of dispersal of sexual reproduction for flowers. So this was one of the most important transitions in the history of terrestrial evolution. This changed everything. These are this picture here, a beautiful picture from Kara Gibson. These are all the described species on Earth represented here. I'm gonna show you the ones that are involved in this amazing mutualism of plants that need to get eaten and the insects that eat them. So the vast majority of all plants are angiosperms, flowering plants. It didn't take long for flowering plants to totally take over the terrestrial environment. There are still gymnosperms, of course, like pines and spruces and things like that, but flowering plants dominate. About a third of insects, or yeah, about a third of insects, in total, about 350,000 species of arthropods combined with these 370,000 species of flowering plants, together with about 1,500 chordates, things like us, or mammals and vertebrates. Um, and the net effect is about a third of all described eukaryotic life on Earth is either a flowering plant or an animal that visits flowers for food. Have you ever thought about that before? This is one of the great trophic linkages on the planet. And we often think about it in terms of the pollination services that insects and other visitors provide to flowers. But this is a third of, of the non-plant life on Earth depends on flowers for food. This is also a trophic relationship. Flowers are food, and insects, pollinators, are a special kind of herbivore, but an herbivore nonetheless. So, how exactly are flowers food? Let's break this down a little more specifically. Um, Pollen is about half of the way in which they are food. So the pollen is first and foremost the male gametophyte, as I said. It's actually it's more than pollen just being like the sperm of the flowers. It contains the sperm, but it is actually a generation of the species. Plants have this thing called metagenesis, where they alternate between um, a sporophyte and gametophyte generation. So the gametophyte is not a part of the plant, it is a generation of the plant. Each grain of pollen is an organism, it is a generation of that plant, and it alternates. It's the gametophyte generation. In flowering plants, the gametophyte is really reduced and the sporophyte is big, but it is a generation of the plant that is instrumental in gene dispersal, but it is also offered as food for pollinators. And that is a pretty radical thing, right? Um, in a sense, it is more radical than just leaves being eaten by an insect that eats leaves, or phloem being sucked by a phloem feeding insect. This is a generation of the plant, whole organisms of the plant being used as bait. But this is essential. This is essential because this is also this gametophyte generation needs to be carried around by insects to be dispersed to other flowers of the same species, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But as food, pollen provides mainly protein and lipids. And for most pollinators, bees in particular, the protein and lipids from pollen are practically the only sources of protein and lipids that they have. So pollen has to provide that sufficiently for them, and it does. This is what pollen looks like under an electron microscope. It's super pretty. The second thing, though, and this is really what angiosperms invented, is nectar. Nectar is purely a reward. So pollen is as I said, the gametophyte generation of the plant. Its primary function is as the dispersal generation to achieve gene dispersal for the plant. Nectar, its primary function, and really its only function, is to draw in insects to the plant. Mostly pollinators, though their nectar is also used to draw in natural enemies, like ants in particular. There are some plants that have very close mutualisms with ants via nectar. The nectar is produced, secreted from nectaries that lie at the base of flowers typically. And this provides the carbohydrate nutrition for pollinators. And in addition to the carbohydrates, that's the main thing, but there are also other trace nutrients, minerals and such that can be important. All right, pollination. So this is why we call them pollinators. Again, when we call them pollinators, we mustn't forget that they are also herbivores. Okay, they're there for a meal. And if we forget that, if we forget to understand them as herbivores, I think we miss a huge piece of their ecology. But they are pollinators. Functionally, they achieve pollination, and they do it because sometimes getting to nectar is a little tricky. This is an Andrina bee, I believe. It's one that I took these pictures in Philly. It's visiting a honeysuckle flower. and it's trying to get to the nectaries. So the nectaries are down here at the base of the flower, but to get there, it's got to push right through the anthers, and it's getting just covered with pollen. Here's the stigma here. This is the female part of the flower. And so this bee is, you can see her tongue sticking out here. She's trying to get it down into the nectars, then to the nectaries. She's getting covered with pollen in the process, and she's going to brush up against this stigma, and pollen that's already on her from the last flower she visited will get deposited on this stigma, and pollen that she's picking up now will get deposited on the stigma of the next flower that she visits. So this is how pollination happens. This is the transfer of pollen that is achieved by pollinators. Here's another case of a flower with some really specialized structures. This is the passion flower. I love this flower. It's like it looks like a shower or something, or like a hair salon. Like the bumblebee, these are our carpenter bees here, Psilocopa virginica. Big bees, they show up and they're going in here for the nectar. And these, the anthers in this case, the pollen bearing structures, they hang right down over the bee, and they just scrape along the top of this big hairy bee and cover it with pollen. And then when the bee comes in for a landing, you can just see the stigma of the flower up here. When the bee comes in for a landing on the next flower, that part of the bee can brush across the stigma and deliver the pollen. So this is a very targeted way to distribute pollen compared to wind pollination, which is what things like gymnosperms, like pine trees or oak trees use, or grasses, corn, for example. For those plants, they just send their pollen to the wind, and if you throw enough of it out there and it blows all over, then there's a decent chance that one grain is going to find its way to the stigma of another flower of the same species. For insect pollinated flowers, they do this in a much more targeted way, and this has been a very successful strategy. I love this picture. I include it whenever I get a chance to, from Sam Droege from USGS. If you get a chance to look through his library of pictures, he does these amazing macro photographs of mostly dead bee specimens. But in this case, this one is just absolutely covered with pollen. And these are very large pollen grains. I think this is, Halictus legatus. It's a small bee, but these are very large pollen grains, probably from like a mallow or maybe a squash plant or something like that. All right, that was pollination. So we have the trophic interaction, we have the pollination. I want to emphasize though that not every time a bee or another animal visits a flower does pollination occur. Do you see what's going on here? This is another carpenter bee here, Psilocopa virginica. This is a hosta plant. It's not one of my pictures, but I think this was taken in Philly. And what's this bee doing? You ever seen a bee doing something like this? Nectaries are down here. Pollen is out here. This bee is not interacting with the pollen bearing structures at all. It's going for the nectar right through the side of the flower. This is called nectar robbing, and it's very common, especially by big bees that can bite through flowers. So carpenter bees are good at it. Bumblebees are good at it. Like this one here's, I think this is monkshood actually. This is a aconitum, I believe, the plant, and this is Bombus lapidarius, a common bumblebee in Europe. And it's just going right through the corolla here to get straight to the nectaries, totally bypassing the anthers. And you can see there are scars all over this plant from where other bees, or perhaps this one, has previously bitten through the corolla to get to the nectar. So this serves as a little reminder that even when insects are pollinators, they're still there for food. This is still an act of herbivory, and it can be a destructive one. Even so, even when it's not pollination, it is still flowers feeding the world. And I think that is really cool and important to think about in its own right. If we just sort of bracket off the question of pollination, this is what a third of the terrestrial eukaryotes, this is what they eat: flowers, nectar, and pollen. All right, that is the end of section 1. This is where my hope is that you come away with a clarified. I hope that the word cloud has rearranged itself into terms with connections. I hope that it's organized itself into something that can be more clearly articulated. I think we're going to do questions at the end, so I'll move on for now. Section 2. So it's time to talk about time. And to guide us on in this conversation, I want to introduce you to this fellow. I don't know if any of you recognize him. I love this painting. This is Heraclitus. Heraclitus was a pre-Socratic philosopher, so lived a long time ago in Greece prior to Socrates. He's worth reading. His writings survive only in what are called the fragments or something, because they're fragments. You can read them all in about an hour. But he's famous for saying about one thing. There's a lot that he says that's interesting, but what he's famous for is one kind of pseudo quote, which goes something like this: "It is impossible to step into the same river twice, because by the time you step a second time, the river is no longer the same river, and in fact, you are no longer the same person." So he is known as the philosopher of change. I think that the field of ecology is ripe for a Heraclitean ecology. And let me show you why. We're going to start by talking about horses. Now, I'm an entomologist. Horses have 4 legs. The things that I know about have 6. So we're already off to a dubious start here. I know even less about people. They only have 2 legs. But those of you who know more about horses than I do may notice that there is something wrong with all of these horses. Give you a second to look at it. Even with my very limited knowledge of horses, something did strike me as a little bit wrong when I first saw this. If we were in an interactive environment, I'm sure that somebody would be raising their hand, calling out the answer right now. Problem is, horses don't look like this when they run, not at all. But in fact, what horses look like when they run is this. The problem is that a galloping horse, the legs of the galloping horse move so fast that the human eye can't follow it. It's a blur. And so for the entirety of the history of humans and horses, which is a very long history, people didn't actually know what a galloping horse looked like. And so artists had to guess, they had to do their best. And it seems like the consensus, at least in European art, was that horses probably looked something like this when they were going at a good clip. But of course, it turns out to be fabulously wrong. Horses look like this, and it was not determined that horses looked like this until somebody who doubted this depiction, who had reservations about it, hired a photographer to figure out how to. There was finally a camera that had a fast enough shutter speed, I guess, to capture this, and hired a photographer to try to settle once and for all what a running horse looks like, and this is the result. And this is all pointed out by this wonderful paper by Young, 2020. So I didn't come up with this illustration, but I find it very compelling. Now, the same is true in ecology. A lot of things in ecology we understand in these static ways, much as people understood the running of a horse, because it is so hard to observe things through time. And so we tend to lump things through time, and we tend to forget that we do it, actually, because it comes so naturally. And I want to show you an example, a relevant one, of course. Plant pollinator interactions. Now, these happen in time, right? We know that, and yet ecologists find it very convenient to forget, because it is a lot of work to go out and sample through time with a fast enough shutter speed, so to speak, with high enough frequency to actually see the patterns of plant pollinator interactions in time. And so what people often do is they go out for a while, they measure everything, and maybe they do it over an extended period of time. Maybe it's a day, maybe it's a growing season, maybe it's even across years. And then for the sake of convenience, they lump it, they throw it all together in a big pot, and they say, okay, here's our interaction network. So we've got our species here, the lines between the species are connections. So you can imagine each of these dots is either a pollinator or a plant, and it's connected to another pollinator or plant. Um, and then, as you know, good ambitious ecologists, we try to tell a good ecological story about this. The problem is what we've actually done is potentially created a fiction. By pulling things through time, it is possible to create something that doesn't actually exist at all at any point in time. And if you don't take time seriously, you can end up um, creating just pure fictions via lumping. And the way this breaks down is like this. If we imagine now that we're, so this is the network at the top here is ignoring time, but now we look at the actual activity periods of these species, we see that they overlap partially, but not completely. And if we extend their interactions through time, so imagine this being 12 months of the year, we see that this global network depicted here only exists in May and June. And it's some partial subset of that network that exists the rest of the year. I say this by way of illustration. I want to break down this more specifically in the rest of the section. But I want you to think about your garden now in this way too. Your garden is not, it's not a snapshot. It is not something that should be pooled through time. Your understanding of your garden should be temporally explicit. It should be understood as a process. And I don't think that comes hard to gardeners, because gardening is already a process, right? There's a time of year when you prepare the soil. There's a time of year when you plant. There's the time when you weed, when you harvest, when you prepare the ground for winter. And the rhythm of gardening is so obviously temporal that we know it. But when you start thinking ecologically, there's a danger of talking to ecologists, because they tend to be out of touch with things like gardens, unfortunately. So don't forget what you already know about your garden. When you think about the ecology of plants and pollinators in your garden, remember that this is an ecology that plays out in time. Let's see some ways in which it does that. So first, at the scale of months. This is the scale at which we talk about phenology. That's the technical word that you've probably heard in the context of flowering phenology, right? Some of you may even be involved in programs that track phenology, the bloom times of plants. It refers also to the activity times of animals. And what I want to discuss is the way in which that the phenology of your garden is, on the one hand, interwoven with the phenology of the pollinators that visit it. So we have to understand not just the phenology of the garden, but the phenology of the pollinators. But it is also embedded in the larger phenology, the phenology outside of your garden, of the landscape scale floral resources. And so I want to look at both of those things. This is just a cool time-lapse video of somebody's garden. This would be a really neat thing to do if you're looking for a project. Yeah, anyway. So pollinator phenology, and there's a lot of literature on this. I pulled out one that I thought would be relevant to the majority of the audience, and the assumption is that I'm talking mostly to people from the eastern United States. I realize that that's not everybody in the audience, but this is a study that was actually done by some colleagues of mine at Penn State after I was no longer there. But so this is representative of central Pennsylvania, but it's going to be broadly representative of much of the eastern US, just kind of correct for latitude, right? At a very coarse scale, we can look at the cumulative abundance of pollinators. So what they did is they trapped and counted bees. I believe they focused just on bees in this study. And they did it for 6 years. So this is a big data set, very, very robust for looking at these patterns. And we get this nice unimodal peak here, right? It goes up, it goes down, and it peaks right in the middle of the year, right about the beginning of July. But it's really more complicated and more interesting than this. If we look at it at the level of individual bee genera, so some of these genera might be familiar to you. You probably recognize Apis anyway. Apis is the genus. There's only one species of Apis in North America. It's Apis mellifera. But each of these are other bee genera, and I'll highlight some of them for you. But what this graph shows is from the same paper. That overall curve is distributed across these different genera, and you get some genera that emerge very early. These are the first bees that you see in the year. You get some that emerge very late, some in the middle, and then on the y-axis here, this is the breadth of their activity period. So the ones that are high on the y-axis are active for a very long time, and the ones that are low have a short flight season. And I in a garden, you have a wonderful opportunity to watch this play out, and I would encourage you to do it. So early in the year, if you live in the eastern U.S., you can expect to see these genera. If you live in the western U.S., you actually will see a lot more because you have much higher bee diversity out there. I think there's one person here from Utah I heard, and I envy that person because you're right in the one of the global hotspots of bee diversity, the desert Southwest in general, Arizona, Utah, Nevada. That's where New Mexico. That's one of, if not the most bee-rich place in the world. So, but we make do what we have in the eastern U.S. and it looks something like this. So these are all pictures that I took, I believe. Yeah, so these are all going to be mine that I took basically in Philly. So these are locally relevant if you're in that area. But the Andrina are the mining bees, and they're often the first ones to come out early in the year. And you'll see, this is the average for the genus, but you'll see them in March too, even late February if you have a warm year. And the same goes for the osmia, the mason bees. And the Andrina, they nest in the ground. The osmia are the ones that show up in those bee hotels that you can make or buy. That's a topic for another conversation. But these are stem nesting bees. So in the wild, they would nest in stems. And instead of, or in addition to buying these bee hotels, another thing you could do to foster these stem nesting bees is just to leave cut stubble in your garden from last year. And that'll be the nesting habitat for these first spring bees that emerge. And later in the year, you get the carpenter bees, the big ones and the little ones. So the Ceratina are the little bitty carpenter bees. They're really very small. They tend to be a sort of dark green color like this. And this is sitting on a very small flower. So you can tell it's a really very small bee. And then, interestingly, the other carpenter bees are the largest bees that you'll see. And this goes both for in the eastern and the western U.S. Xylocopa bees. They can be mistaken for bumblebees when you're getting used to identifying them, but once you get the hang of it, you can tell them apart. Xylocopa virginica is the one that we have in the eastern U.S. This is a male that I'm holding here. That's why I'm holding it. I would not hold a female bee like this because female bees have stingers. Male bees do not, and it's because a stinger is a modified ovipositor. It's an egg-laying organ. So you can win a lot of bets this way. I'd imagine if you can get people to dare you to grab a bee and you can correctly identify that it's a male. It's easy with Xylocopa virginica because the males have this white face, and the females don't. So they're gorgeous bees, and I think that they're the things I love about them far outweigh the fairly negligible damage that they do to build structures. The bees themselves honestly don't do serious damage. They drill little holes. What serious damage can happen when a woodpecker finds out that the bees are in there, because woodpeckers love to eat these huge chunky bee larvae that are just delicious, and especially if you live in a place with something like pileated woodpeckers. That will do some substantial damage to your fascia board of your gazebo or whatever. But anyway, these are delightful bees. And then we also have these in the east, but not so much in the west. You have these bright green bees like Algochlorella or Algochlora and Algochlorella here. And you see these a lot on the late summer asters. And Melisodes is another late season bee that you get mostly on asters, sunflowers especially. These are called longhorn bees. They often have noticeably long antennae. So this is all playing out in your garden, and I encourage you to attend to the phenology of pollinators and realize that Seeing something visiting a flower in May is going to be completely different from the things you see visiting flowers in June and July and August. Um, and this enriches the experience of pollinators in a garden, which is something that we will return to. Now I want to step back from, I've relied on other people's research so far. I want to tell you about my own research, and this has to do with landscape scale floral phenology, which, as I said earlier, is the other kind of phenology that your garden interacts with. So if your garden is interwoven with the phenology of pollinators, it is embedded in this larger scale floral phenology. And so if you want to understand the floral phenology of your garden, you have to understand the floral phenology of the landscape that it's a part of. Where does your garden fit in? I can answer this question pretty well, I think, for Philadelphia, at least, because that's where I did my work. And I think this probably applies to loosely to temperate regions in general, though with local variation, of course. So this is Philadelphia, for those of you who don't recognize it from a satellite image. We've got the Schuylkill River here and the Delaware River here, and Center City is nestled between them. In this study, I set up honeybee apiaries at sites all around the city, and I did that in collaboration with this fella, Don Shump, who's a good friend of mine and collaborator. He runs the Philadelphia Bee Company, and so he already had the bees and the apiaries. And I talked to Don and said, "Hey, can we use these bees to learn something about flowers in Philadelphia?" And he said yes. He's an entrepreneur. He's good at saying yes to projects. And this was a lot of fun. We spent 2 years doing this. And what we did was, among other things, we tracked the weight of these colonies. So each colony had a data logging hive scale underneath it like this, and we logged hourly readings. So we got to really have a fine resolution trace of the weights of these colonies. And then I analyzed these data with the idea that the weight change of a colony comes principally from the resources that it gathers from the landscape. And so when a colony is gaining weight, there's a net flux of resources into the colony, and when it's losing weight, it's burning up more than it's gaining. And we can use this as a way to learn about landscape scale floral resource availability in a complex urban environment where it would be very hard or impossible to like run transects and put quadrats on the ground and count flowers, right? You can't run a transect down Broad Street. So yeah, you can, however, sample honeybee colonies, and this turned out to be a really neat way to understand floral resources in Philadelphia. And the results, in summary, look like this. So this is the first order difference of the honeybee weight chain, or weight curve. So what that means is I took each weight value and subtracted it from the one that came before. So this is a curve of weight change. So whenever the curve is above zero, the colonies are gaining weight. At zero, the colonies are completely stable, and below zero, the colonies are losing weight. Makes sense? So I did this in 2017, 2018, 2 years of data showed basically the same thing. I sampled longer in 2018, but we had these two strong resource pulses in the spring where colonies gain weight massively. And this indicates that there must be a big surplus, or at least a high availability, high standing crop of nectar, mainly because honey is the heavy stuff in a hive in May, and then again in June. There are these two big flows, and this first one is probably it's probably black locust, I would guess. The second one probably has more to do with clover. Some tilia could be involved here too. I'm not going to dwell on that right now, but these first two flows end in about in July, and then things really level off through July, and then in August, every single colony in my study system lost weight. August is a time of extreme resource scarcity, at least in Philadelphia, and this is actually consistent with things that have been described by various lines of evidence in North America, in Europe, in Japan, and I think that is characteristic of temperate climates in general, maybe not universally, but after this summer dearth period, there's a pulse of resources in September, and then that's about it. Now, forgive the very clumsy graphics here, but let's just lay that curve from Turley et al. On top of this. We're going to assume that the pollinator phenology is roughly the same as what it was in Penn State, and we get something like this. And you realize when you look at it this way that bees that emerge at different times of year can find themselves interacting with completely different floral resource situations. So bees early in the season, Andrena, Osmia, Hoplitus, and maybe these bees that emerge right in this second peak here emerge into a really a banquet of abundant floral resources. But this gives way to scarcity at interestingly about the same time that the populations of bees are peaking. It peaks right about this, more or less concurrent with this big flow that we have in early summer. But then populations are still really high, and there's suddenly not much to forage on. And I think that's why the availability gets driven down so low. You've got all these bees flying and not a lot of flowers. You might wonder why bees fly at this time of year at all. And I think it probably has to do with the fact that bees are really constrained by the shoulders of the seasons. This middle of the year, scarcity may be a problem, but at the shoulders of the seasons in spring and fall, I think it's the abiotic factors that are the problem. It's the late frosts, it's the early frosts, it's the rains. So there are challenges whenever you fly, but now think about your garden. Your garden fits into this somewhere, right? And one way to understand the function of your garden is to try to use it to fill gaps in this landscape scale floral resource curve. So if I were planting a garden with the idea of supplying resources at a time when they were scarce, with the caveat, of course, that I'm only doing it at a very local scale, but even so, I would aim for things that bloom in July and August. It is likely that the supplemental flowers of my garden are not really needed in May and June. Things are really rich then, but July and August, things are scarce. So that's one way to think about the function of your garden in its context. All right, I'm going to speed up a little bit because I don't want to rush through the end. But I do want to talk about minutes because this is a study that I just did last year and I'm really excited about it. So this is the scale of behavior. We're looking at within day variation now, in the orders of minutes, hours. And this is a study I did in Germany now, and the results actually kind of shook me up. I'm still processing it, and I want to share them with you and see what you think. So my question was, do pollinators use up the floral resources available to them? This is a very basic question that surprisingly has been very rarely addressed and usually addressed in kind of a glancing way in the ecological literature. And so I decided to really square up to it and say, okay, let's find this out. So these are the plants that I sampled. I did it in grasslands around Würzburg. So what I did was I bagged flowers to keep pollinators out. I did this early in the morning, and then I came back around midday and I sampled nectar from both bagged flowers and unbagged flowers, and I compared the standing crop of nectar. So the bags keep the pollinators out, the unbagged flowers were visited, and you can see how much of that the theoretical standing crop was depleted by the bees that visited it. This is a little video of me sampling nectar from, in this case, plum flower. Using microcapillary tubes. This was really fun work. So I'm pretending to be a bee, and you see in the tip of the tube there is a little bit of nectar, and then I just measure it with a digital caliper like this, and yeah, really simple methods. Just out of curiosity, I can't get feedback, but take a minute and think. What do you think the depletion rate would be? And maybe imagine it for your garden, but how much of the total nectar available in the morning do you think is consumed by, say, 11 a.m.? Curious about your intuition, so you can tell me later, but keep that in mind. And now this is the result that I found. I was blown away by this. The short story is that open flowers were essentially empty almost every time. Bagged flowers had a good amount of nectar, open flowers, empty. And this is just a few hours after sunrise. Um, and I remember vividly when this set in. I was in, it was the first grassland site that I sampled. And I was getting the hang of the methods and I was sampling. I was like, okay, got some nectar, didn't get some nectar, got some nectar, didn't get some nectar. And I realized that every open flower I sampled was empty. And I was looking at this meadow that was full of flowers and with bumblebees and butterflies and other bees flitting about. And I would normally look at that and see that as like this ecological feel good story. Like, oh, look at all these flowers, the bees, this is wonderful. It was a scene of desperation. It was bees visiting empty flowers. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I'll let you just kind of chew on that. But I don't know how universal this is. I don't think it's, I don't think I would find this at all times and places. Last year it was a drought year. It was very hot, dry in the summer. I think this is an extreme case, but I don't think it's that extreme. I think that I've had the wrong assumptions about the within day patterns of resource availability. And one thing that this makes clear is that the first bees that show up in the morning have a totally different experience of the flowers than the ones that show up even just an hour later. By the time they show up, most of the flowers have so little nectar that I couldn't get it out with a microcapillary tube. So something to think about. All right. I have probably going to go a little long. I hope that's okay, but I don't want to cut it short because the ending is important. This is going to be a short section, and it's going to be a somewhat deflating section because I want to put something in context that I think is important to put in context. We're going to talk about time at the scale of millennia now. This is the scale not of phenology or behavior, but of evolution and biogeography. This is how species originate and change and distribute themselves. They do it over millennia. And Gollum is going to help us understand this. This is one of the riddles that he tells Bilbo. I'm reading The Hobbit to my kids right now, so it's fresh in my mind. And yeah, good illustrations are not to be passed up. This thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays king, ruins town, and beats mountain down. It's time, of course, if you haven't read the book, but at the scale of millennia, time renders your garden very, very small indeed. I want to ask you two somewhat uncomfortable questions. What did your garden look like 100 years ago? All right. If you know, and what do you think your garden will look like 100 years from now? I venture to guess that for most of you, your garden didn't exist 100 years ago. And realistically, your garden's not going to exist 100 years from now. And if we put this in the context of the story of plants and pollinators, it is sobering. Let's just take the last 100 million years. That gets us back to about the point where this angiosperm radiation was going on. If you have a particularly long-lived garden that you get 100 years out of, let's imagine that this evolutionary story is a 2-hour movie. Your garden is 7 milliseconds of that. I bring this up not to be depressing, but just to say that I think sometimes gardens are oversold as a solution to conservation, as a solution to species loss. I think there are solutions to species loss. I don't think gardens are going to save species. And I think it's important that we not get distracted by things that may be good in their own right, but we shouldn't think that they're doing something they're not. I'm going to show you why they're still important, but the scales of space and time over which species need to be saved are so much bigger than your garden that we really need to think in terms of our agricultural systems, of our economy, of our decisions about land use, how it's governed, things like that. But after that brief deflating section, I want to change the tone now and finish strong, I hope. So what are gardens for? Moments. This is going to start off in a way that may feel a little fluffy and speculative. It's not. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it will get concrete, I assure you. So Uh, this is what I was gonna indulge in if I had time that I needed to fill. I don't have time that I need to fill, so I think I'm not gonna indulge in it. But one of the great things about moving to Germany was getting to know the literature of Michel Ende. I encourage you to read it. Here it is in English. We can talk about it sometime, not right now. What I want to talk about instead, in the time we have left, is the term that has been coined, the extinction of experience. This was coined by Robert Michael Pyle, and I take some special satisfaction in the fact that Pyle is an entomologist. He studies butterflies. So it is this interaction between flowers and pollinators that motivated him to say, hey, there's a problem here. There's an extinction of experience, and I'll show you what that means. It was popularized by Richard Louv in this book that was, I'm sure you've heard of. I want to read this little quote here from this article on the topic. The article is from Gary Navhan and Sarah St. Antoine, but the quote here is from Paolo Calvino, and he says that the new knowledge that the human race is acquiring does not compensate for the knowledge spread only by direct oral transmission, which, once lost, cannot be regained or retransmitted. No book can teach what can be learned only in childhood if you lend an alert ear and eye to the song and flight of birds, and if you can find someone who knows how to give them a specific name. This is the extinction of experience, and it is not just it is not just a story we can tell that resonates in some way with what we think is going on. I want to emphasize that it is a measurable, a dramatically measurable extinction of experience. This is a big literature. I picked one paper that I especially like, but you could pick many. And I'm just going to flip through some of the data here. So this is the percentage of so adults versus children, and frequency of visit to natural areas. So this is so older people do it way more than younger people. Older people are much more likely to do it every day or 1 to 2 times per week. Younger people do it 1 to 2 times per month or less often. How about frequency of outdoor activity? Same pattern. This is from the UK, I think. Now we're going to go, I think this is either the US or Netherlands. So children participating in outdoor activities down 5%, just 1997 to 2003. These data are already old. Time spent outdoors, same pattern. People who played in natural areas in childhood, this is the decline as you go from people in their 50s down to people in their 10s, teens. Here's one that I can especially relate to. Catching insects was like one of the most important things. Catching insects and climbing trees, 2 of the most important things about my childhood. This is from Japan now, and again, over just a 10-year period. The actual contact with the world is declining. And this means that when we talk about conservation, we're not just talking about the conservation of species, we're talking about the conservation of experience. If I had more time, I would probably wax more philosophical on this, but I want to make the point in a more condensed way. Gardens may not save species, but they can certainly resist this creeping and frankly rapid extinction of experience. And by personal illustration, this is where I grew up when I was really young, until I was 6 years old. This is Oxford Circle, row home neighborhood in Philly. This little bit here, if you can see my cursor, this is the garden that my dad lovingly cultivated. Not much to it. This is not going to stop anything from going extinct, I'll tell you that much. But it stopped my experience of the world from going extinct. I spent hours out here, just in the crack between the sidewalk and the grass right here, experiencing insects. More than that, though, it's not just about my personal story. This is a paper from Madison et al. 2008, and they census the pollinators of urban New York City, so it doesn't get any denser than this. This is an example of a garden in the Bronx, and they found 54 species of bee in this maximally urban setting of New York. And I want to highlight one species in particular, one that they found, Peponapus pruinosa. It's a squash bee. If you plant squash, you know about it. One thing that I love about this bee is it illustrates, it does this itself, and it illustrates something that all bees do. Indeed, insects seem to do with a remarkable ability, is they find patches of habitat that you would never expect them to find. If you plant a squash in the densest urban environment you can think of, a squash bee will find it. I don't know how. I don't know what they're doing all the time that lets them find these squash plants, but one will show up, and lo and behold, in this study, one did. This picture that I found from my naturalist, this was observed here. This is this is Chicago. So your garden, a little patch of flowers in the most forbidding landscape will be colonized by pollinators, and that is enough to ward off this extinction of experience. And indeed, let's not forget, this is not going to stop Pepinapis from going extinct, which, by the way, it's not really in any danger of that right now, but it's still a habitat for this particular bee, and this particular bee matters, and it matters that you were there to see it. Let's not forget that. But this makes a quantifiable difference. I'm slightly over time, I'm going to speed up, but we're almost there. We're almost there. Hang in there. Again, this is a big literature. I could have pulled out a lot of things to cite. I like this paper especially, and I pulled it out. And this shows that so this is the result of a statistical model. What you need to understand is when this dot and line are on the right side of zero, that means something had a positive effect. And when it's on the left side of zero, it had a negative effect. I want to highlight gardening here. Gardening had a measurable positive effect on the probability of somebody expressing liking toward insects. So it increases the probability of liking insects, and importantly, it decreases both fear and disgust responses toward insects. Again, I pulled this out because it's one nice illustration of this, but this is not just a warm fuzzy story. Gardening has a measurable effect on people's attitudes toward the world, and it's because it gives them this rich and intimate, direct experience of the world. That if you live in, a place like this, you're not going to get it in Yosemite. You're not going to get it in some vast, pristine natural area. You're going to get it in a garden, or you're not going to get it at all. Finally, last thing, I want to talk about the amplification of experience. So the extinction can be resisted by the conservation, by gardening, but we can take this to the next level. And I want to hand you off to a better guide than I. And that is John Weir Laws, whose work I absolutely adore. I commend this book to you. It is in fact free. I don't know how this guy makes money because he makes most of his stuff available free online. But I encourage you to explore this concept of nature journaling. I just want to illustrate some. So I want to show you some examples of it, and I'll leave it to you to track it down. But the idea is that you take your observations of nature, or in fact of your garden, focus it on your garden if you wish, and you discipline yourself to do it in a much more detailed and kind of discursive, expansive way, and ideally a way that involves other people too. You make it a cultural activity, a multimodal activity that engages the technical side of counting things, and the visual side of drawing things, and the creative side of writing about it. And this can be done at, this is an example of like the features of nature journaling or garden journaling. And it can be done at a level appropriate for young kids. There's a nice one about leaves, one about the floral phenology of bean plants. And it can be done at the advanced level if you're somebody who draws birds like this. This is super nice. I'm not somebody who draws birds like this, but I respect it. I commend this to you. It's something that I want to do in my own family. And I think this is a way to take that power of gardens to fend off the extinction of experience, and indirectly, I will add, to create a culture of people who will make the kinds of decisions that actually do protect species at a larger scale. And I think that this is one of the most powerful tools we have to change the world indirectly through gardening. And plants and pollinators are an amazing place to start because they are so readily visible, and the interactions that we see lend themselves to narrative telling so naturally. Here's a really nice one that just to illustrate that it can get quantitative too. This is the sort of thing that you would do for scientific paper. So, all right, I'm gonna wrap this up, and we're still gonna have 10 minutes for questions. So, in summary, pollinators are a special kind of herbivore. Whatever else they are still that. And flowering plants have perfected the art of being eaten. Uh, I I have a paper that's about to come out now, in which I make this argument, and I had to really fight for it because people were pushed back a little at the idea of understanding pollinators as basically florivores, things that eat flowers. But I stuck to my guns, and I think it's gonna fly. And I really think that this is an important perspective on understanding for understanding plants and pollinators at that basic trophic level. Gardens are woven into the temporal ecology of pollinators at both seasonal and diel scales. They're drops in the ocean of pollinator evolution and biogeography. Keeping these things in tension, I think, is important. And then, while gardens may not themselves prevent the extinction of species, they enable us to resist the extinction of experience, which, importantly, is probably the most important way to prevent the extinction of species, by creating a culture of people who care about them, who can name them, and love them. I'll end on this slide because I'm very proud of it, and I will open the floor to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was great. We do have a question in the Q&A, and everyone, please feel free to type your questions in. Stephanie asks, when the nectar conversation, referring back to that, do the empty flowers resupply nectar, or are they nectarless for the rest of their life?
Yeah, that's a very observant question. And the short answer is, well, maybe there isn't a short answer. Yes, kind of, we don't really know. Based on the evidence that is out there, as I said, this has not been measured nearly as much as you might expect it to have been, but it does seem like flowers, there's a rhythm to the secretion of nectar. It's not constant, but it also doesn't typically stop completely, I don't think. So it tends to accumulate overnight in temperate areas where there's not a lot of night foraging that happens. And then it peaks early in the morning, and then it does decline because it's drawn down by the pollinators. But I think that there is a continual secretion. And the way I imagine, what I think I was seeing is that the flowers were visited so heavily that there was never a chance for them to accumulate a pool of nectar that was enough for me to sample. What I think is that the bees were experiencing something like drinking from a dripping faucet. So if you imagine turning a faucet on so it just goes, and then you try to suck on it to get a drink. I think it was something like that. You're never going to fill a cup with a faucet like that, but maybe you can drink it one drip at a time. And what has been noted is that there tends to be a little, so you get a minimum of nectar around midday, but if you measure later in the day, it goes up again a little bit. And it's because probably the secretion continues, but the rate of foraging drops off. And so in the afternoon or evening, you start to get a little replenishment of nectar.
Thank you. Alex asks, so I guess the act of planting Asclepias for monarchs doesn't directly support the butterfly, but as you say, supports human experience?
Well, I want to, it depends. I don't want to dismiss it. What I want to avoid is the kind of bourgeois overselling of gardening as saving the world. And it might be for the reasons that I said later, but let's not forget how small a garden is and how unstable it is. So especially if you're thinking of it as like habitat for something to colonize and live in, well, yeah, it is great and meaningful that the things that are in it now are in it. That is good, but conservation needs to be a centuries, millennia long plan, right? And gardens do not achieve that. Now, importantly, monarchs, the situation with monarchs and Asclepias is somewhat different in a couple of ways. First of all, it's not a floral resource for them. It's a larval resource, as you know. So it's what they need to lay their eggs on. And it plays a rather different role for monarchs than your garden plays for the bees that visit it, because bees are central place foragers. They nest somewhere and they go out and they find resources to come back. Monarchs are not central place foragers, and moreover, they're migratory. So this is a very special, very weird case. But they need to find a string of Asclepias as they spread north and are ovipositing on plants. They need to find it where they go. So I think this is a case where, I don't want to discourage anybody from planting plants for pollinators. That's not my point. And I think the case of monarchs and Asclepius is probably a really good idea to do that. Now, that alone, again, is good. I don't want to oversell it because it's the Asclepius. It's good to have it there. Really, what makes monarchs so precarious is that they all nest in small patches of forest in Mexico, and that is the weak point there. If that habitat is lost, then it doesn't matter how much Asclepius you have. A little bit of Asclepius in your garden is not going to make or break the monarch, but it's not going to hurt them. It's going to be good. And that is a case where a kind of decentralized, diffuse planting of something actually makes a difference because it connects things for a migratory species. So yeah, again, don't like, I'm trying to find a careful middle ground here. I don't want to oversell gardening as conservation per se, because I think that distracts from efforts that are more important for conservation per se. I don't want to undersell it either. So I guess use your discernment and find the middle ground is what I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense. And your point about having gardens be that kind of incubator for young people growing up and learning about this stuff, and that's also the, maybe we can have, both. It's the gardens to do that over time and generationally, and then that's going to cause people hopefully to learn more about larger conservation efforts. And I think that's a good point.
Yeah. What I'm
Yeah.
trying to push back on is a sort of like pop environmentalism with like Cheerios panning out seed packets and thinking that like that's going to make a
Mhm.
difference. Like what would make a difference is if we didn't grow agronomic crops over vast hectares of land, right? Like that would make a difference. A few seed packets aren't going to change that. But by all means, plant your garden, plant it well, and make the most of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have a question from Sarah. Have you used iNaturalist as a resource for predicting nectar sources for pollinator species?
So the use of iNaturalist as a tool in research, it's certainly attractive. It, um, the problem is to predict nectar availability, you really need something quantitative. You need to know something about like the density of plants in a place, and iNaturalist is not good for quantitative because well, people observe the things that catch their interests or for whatever reason or what they're looking for. So you can get a sense for presence absence, maybe, at least presence. You can never prove absence, least of all by iNaturalist, but you can get a sense for where things are consistently present, but I would not use it as an estimate of like floral resource availability. Now, what I think is an interesting potential of iNaturalist, it takes a lot more work, but you can actually look at the pictures and it becomes a kind of database of flower pollinator interactions. So if you can do the work by identifying the flower and the insect in pictures that show flower insect interactions, you could build up a kind of interaction network that way, with of course the strong caveat that this is very biased toward the things that people readily observe and are motivated to snap a picture of. But yeah, it's a good question, and I think we're still in the early stages of figuring out what can and can't be done with these kind of crowdsourced data platforms.
Looks like we have time for one more question. Sarah also asks, is there a good example of a flagship species like the monarch within Central Europe?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting question. Thanks for asking about Europe. It's very considerate. Yeah, the monarch is really special. We don't have anything quite so iconic as that, and justifiably so. The monarch is amazing. But people in Europe, especially in Germany, at least I can speak for Germany, they're very sensitive to environmental things in general, and to insects in particular, to pollinators. Bumblebees are pretty charismatic. I mean, honeybees, it's complicated and somewhat problematic, but honeybees do serve as a flagship species here and back in North America. Let me think. There are probably some butterfly species. I'm not a butterfly expert personally. But I always say that bumblebees are probably the most charismatic flower visiting insects in Germany. And they are great as flagship species because they're conspicuous, and they're also species that can often be identified to the species level by ordinary people, just on the wing without having to collect specimens. So I would encourage you to, if you're looking for a species to tell stories about, if you're looking for a nature journaling, garden journaling subject, and you want to narrow it down so you're not overextending yourself, bumblebees would be a great place to start.
Well, thank you so much, Doug. This has been great. And I want to thank everyone for joining. I want to remind you all to look out for my email afterwards. I will let you know when the recording is viewable, and it'll be up there until June 14th. So if you want to watch it, make sure to do before then or rewatch it. I wanted to also mention that this Thursday we have a course coming up, a session about medicinal and edible plants through a cultural lens with Jared Rosenbaum. So check that one out. And next week we're going to learn about Chanticleer with Executive Director Bill Thomas, which is Chanticleer is a garden in Wayne, PA. It's a visual tour and behind the scenes look at what the Washington Post calls one of the most interesting and edgy public gardens in America. So that'll be a cool one. And then also next week, the Bower, we're going to explore the Bower, which is a native plant and sculpture garden with co-founders Bill and Jane Alice, with collaborating designer Ethan Drafkin. And that is also in Pennsylvania. It's a sanctuary where art and the natural world coexist in harmony. So go to learning.ndal.org to read more about our upcoming sessions. And lastly, please complete the evaluation form on the portal to let us know your thoughts on this session. I think that's all I've got. Again, thank you so much, Doug. We really appreciate you doing this in the evening, your time. So thank you again.
Happy to be here as always. Thanks, Sarah.
Have a good day and night. Thanks, everyone.